Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wondered if certain kinds of sad thoughts are more dangerous than others, and who might be more likely to have them? That's exactly what the new study we're diving into today wanted to figure out. Scientists are trying to understand suicide ideation, which is basically having thoughts about ending your life. It's a really complex area, and people often talk about passive thoughts like wishing you weren't alive, and active thoughts like thinking you should kill yourself. For a long time, the idea has been that passive thoughts are less of a big deal, and active thoughts are a sign of much higher risk. But this new research questions some of those long-held beliefs. They wanted to see if there are actually different groups or classes of people based on the types of suicidal thoughts they have, and whether they've made plans or tried to act on those thoughts. And an even more interesting part is they looked at how these groups might differ based on things like gender, race, and sexual orientation. So what did they do? Well, they gathered a group of young adults who had recently experienced suicidal thoughts. They asked them a bunch of questions about their lifetime experiences with different types of suicidal thoughts. Whether they had planned ways to die, if they had prepared to attempt suicide, and if they had ever attempted suicide. Think of it like a really detailed questionnaire about their internal struggles. They used a statistical method called latent class analysis. Now, this might sound complicated, but imagine you have a bunch of people and you want to see if they naturally fall into different groups based on how they answer a set of questions. Latent class analysis does just that. It looks for patterns in responses to identify distinct subgroups of people. They identified 13 different thoughts and behaviors related to suicide to do this. And here's where it gets really interesting. They found not just 2, but 3 distinct groups or classes of suicidal ideation. The first class they called low risk. This group, about 23% of the participants, mostly had passive thoughts. These are thoughts like wishing you could disappear or that life wasn't worth living. Importantly, this group didn't have active thoughts about killing themselves, and they hadn't made plans or attempted suicide. Then there was the moderate risk class, making up about 37% of the participants. This group also had those passive thoughts, but they also showed signs of planning, specifically thinking about a way or method to end their life, even if they didn't have active thoughts about killing themselves, or hadn't prepared or attempted. This is a critical finding because it challenges the idea that planning only happens with active thoughts. Finally, the largest group, about 40% of the participants, was labeled high risk. As you might expect, this group had both passive and active suicidal thoughts. They also reported planning, including thinking about a method and a place, and they had engaged in preparation or even attempted suicide. So, this high-risk group clearly had the most serious range of experiences. Now, let's talk about who was in these groups. The study also looked at gender, race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation, and they found some significant differences. For example, racialized people were more represented in the moderate risk class compared to the high risk class. This is a bit unexpected, as you might assume racialized individuals would be more in the highest risk category. But the most striking finding related to social identity was that people who identified as 2S-LGBTQIA were much more likely to be in the high-risk class than in either the low-risk or moderate-risk classes. This strongly suggests that being part of the 2S-LGBTQIA community is associated with a greater likelihood of experiencing the most severe forms of suicidal ideation and behavior. They also looked at intersections, meaning how these identities combine, like being a racialized woman or a bisexual man. While some of these intersectional differences were interesting, they didn't remain statistically significant after the researchers adjusted for doing so many comparisons, which is a standard practice to avoid false positives. So, what does all of this mean? It tells us that the old way of thinking about suicidal thoughts, just as simple passive versus active, might be too simplistic. The researchers found that passive thoughts can sometimes be linked to planning even without active suicidal thoughts. This suggests a more complex spectrum of risk than we previously understood. The finding that 2S-LGBTQIA individuals are more represented in the highest risk group is a really important call to action. It highlights that certain social identities are associated with greater vulnerability to severe suicidal experiences. This could be due to a number of factors like discrimination, lack of social support, or mental health challenges that are more common in these groups. The study also hinted that racialized people might have some protective factors, which is an area that needs more investigation. We need to understand what those factors are so they can be leveraged. Scroll limitations and future directions. The current study addressed key gaps in our understanding of the patterning of suicidal thoughts and suicide-related behaviors at an individual level, and social identity-based differences in the frequency of these patterns. Nonetheless, results should be interpreted in light of several key limitations. First, analysis focused on social identity were quite broad in that they focused on the overall effect of marginalization, i.e. binary comparisons, a decision necessitated by small and inadequate cell sizes. For more specific comparisons, there may be more specific differences within social identity variables, e.g. differences between being Black versus Asian or lesbian versus bisexual. We also grouped cisgender and transgender people, despite transgender identity being associated with increased risk for suicidal thoughts and behaviors. Thoma et al. 2019. Subsequent work in larger samples with more refined comparisons and perhaps additional social identity variables could uncover more granular and far-reaching insights. Scroll now, every study has its limitations, and this one is no different. The researchers noted that their look at social identities was pretty broad. They grouped people into general categories, and there might be more specific differences within those categories that they couldn't see with the sample size they had. For example, they grouped all transgender and non-binary people together, even though being transgender can be associated with unique risks. They also mentioned that the study overrepresented people with recent suicidal ideation, which means these findings might not apply to the general population who don't have these thoughts. Plus, the sample was mostly young adults and predominantly women, so it's important to be cautious when generalizing to other age groups or genders. One of the biggest areas for future research is figuring out the why behind these social identity differences. This study showed us that differences exist, but it didn't explore the underlying reasons. Why are two SLGBTQI individuals more likely to be in the high-risk group? What specific experiences or social factors contribute to this? That's the next frontier. Understanding these mechanisms is crucial for developing targeted and effective support. Overall, this research is a significant step forward in understanding the complex landscape of suicidal thoughts and behaviors. It highlights the importance of moving beyond simple categories and looking at the nuanced patterns that emerge within individuals. The findings about social identity underscore the urgent need for more inclusive and culturally sensitive approaches to suicide prevention. This kind of specific research helps us move away from one-size-fits-all solutions towards more personalized and effective interventions. It's a reminder that understanding the human experience, especially during times of distress, requires looking at all the facets of identity. What do you think about these findings? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this video helpful, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more research breakdowns, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.